What would it be like if feminists and gender identitarians were allowed to debate on the same platform together? On Wednesday the 9th of December 2020, the Women Equalities Select Committee heard oral evidence on the subject of reform of the Gender Recognition Act. Evidence was heard from two separate panels of experts and academics. In Session 1, Professor Stephen Whittle, OBE, Professor Alex Sharpe, Dr. Ruth Pearce. And in Session 2, Professor Rosa Freedman, Professor Kathleen and Professor Alice Sullivan. Here you can find the members of the Women Equalities Select Committee. Those at the top can be spotted in the video. Here are some of the oral contributions arranged so that we are able to imagine what it might be like if people were able to share debating platforms and take it in turns to speak. Could you outline the process of obtaining a diagnosis of gender dysphoria, what that process involves, please?
I think we should recognise that a diagnosis for gender dysphoria, apart from pathologising and infantilising the whole trans community, runs against the grain of current medical best practice globally. So if we look at WPATH, an organisation that are often neglected in debates and don't ever seem to be consulted, even though they're quite clearly the lead medical body in this field. In 2017, they issued a gender identity recognition statement, making it very clear that, in their view, gender recognition as a legal matter should be completely uncoupled from any of these medical considerations, and that it was actually contrary to good medical health and well-being to so require. This is also consistent with the Yoga Carta principles, principles articulated by an international human rights experts in 2007 and developed since that time. This body is a body made up of leading judges, the former United Nations Commissioner for Human Rights and leading lawyers around the world. But they also, in Principle 31, have made it very clear that the right to legal recognition should be something we think about as completely unrelated to, completely uncoupled from any kind of medical intervention. So just make those points in addition to what Stephen has said.
And I would also add to that in fact from 2022, the diagnosis of gender dysphoria that's required by the Act should no longer exist. Our obligations under the World Health Organization are that we should move to the new standards for diagnosis, in which gender dysphoria has been extinguished, is now a new diagnosis under a separate non-mental health condition chapter of gender incongruence, and we will be asking, I feel already we are asking clinicians to diagnose something that no longer exists in the medical lexicon.
I'm told that 41% of applicants for gender recognition certificates are now under the age of 29, and that's a big change. So I think it's very important that they get the right healthcare, including, and I think we should also consider this, you should consider this in light of the fact that CAMS, Children and Adolescent Mental Health Services, is chronically underfunded. So there needs to be full mental health provision for younger people contemplating a life-changing change. And it is a life-changing change for many of them, because for many of them it will involve taking medication or having surgery that they might later come to regret. So I think there should be full attention on the healthcare of trans people. That seems perfectly reasonable.
For example, Lisa Littman's research on the surge in girls presenting with gender dysphoria in the current generation. Michelle Moore is another example, a disability scholar who's raised questions about the prevalence of gender transitioning among autistic girls and has faced a campaign of harassment. But the results of this go way beyond academia. Obviously, this is painful for the academics involved, but there are serious human consequences to the wider chilling effect. You will, I'm sure, be aware of the case of Kira Bell, a young woman who has just brought a successful case against the Tavistock because she regrets the medical treatment that she received and feels she was poorly advised. And the judges in that case highlighted the lack of data and evidence on youth transition, and the fact that the Tavistock failed to collect some really obvious data, including the number of autistic girls that they were seeing.
I think that the key thing for me is around gender dysphoria. I take on board the point that the World Health Organization has said that transgenderism should not be medicalized anymore, seen as a medical condition. But if people don't have gender dysphoria, then I think that we need some very explicit guidance on the basis at which they access free NHS healthcare if it's not a medical condition. And this really needs to be worked out, because it's all well and good to say we don't want to call it a medical condition, but then how does that impact trans healthcare, which is a key issue that I keep coming back to.
You argue that there is a mistaken understanding of the proper legal relationship between the GRA and the Equality Act, and that the harm claims lack proper evidential basis. Could you elaborate on that for me, please?
Yes, thank you, Angela. We might think of the Equality Act and the Gender Recognition Act as two streams of water that rarely touch, and certainly in this particular context. So obviously there are sex-based exceptions in the Equality Act, we all know that. They currently operate when they're proportional, and that will continue. And Theresa May has made that clear. Every politician who's talked about that has made that clear. There's nothing that's going to change. And the reason why there won't be a change, the fear, well, first of all, the fear itself has no basis empirically. There are a handful of cases out of a population of hundreds of thousands. There is no sound empirical basis for thinking that harm is a problem. There is no problem. Gender critical feminism is a solution in search of a problem. We should recognise this, that there isn't a problem to begin with. And if we look to the technical law, then what we have is if somebody like myself or Stephen who have a gender recognition certificate, so I'm a trans woman, I have a gender recognition certificate, but I am still subject to the sex-based exceptions if it can be shown that they are proportionate. So at the moment, all trans women, and the focus tends to be on trans women in this panic, all trans women are subject to the sex-based exceptions. And if we have more trans women with a GRC in the future, all of those people will be subject to the sex-based exceptions. So the status quo will remain the same in that respect. Now, people can argue about whether the law as it currently exists is good or not, or should be changed, but there'll be no change in the way that I've just outlined. And the people who suggest there will be are just creating alarm when there's no legal or empirical basis for it, as people keep telling people if they were willing to listen.
Can I go? I think the important thing that really needs to be got across in discussing is that this is about male patterns. If we're talking about the worry about violence and sexual assault rate, women are much more likely than men to be sexually assaulted, and where they are sexually assaulted, in 90% plus of cases, it is males that do so. And we're not just talking about rape, we're talking about other kinds of sexual assault, voyeurism, flashing, upskirting, taking revenge porn. You know, there's a range of things here that can happen where women undress and speak and sleep in public spaces. And the worry, you know, up until now, it has been uncontroversial that we exclude all males, including all the innocent ones, and the majority of, you know, reasonable people, on the basis that we want to also exclude a few malfeasant people. And that has been perfectly well understood. That it was never a character reference. It was never supposed to say that all males were bad, because they clearly aren't. Exactly the same logic applies with self-ID and the thought about spaces, exactly. But so in other words, it's excluding the many innocents in order to focus on a few. But there's no reason to think that once you self-ID as a woman, you become, you know, less subject to the statistical generalizations that apply to the male sex. Having said that, I would just add that in the last trans inquiry, you should look again at the evidence submitted by the British Association of Gender Specialists, or I can check that and send you it, and by the British Psychological Society, who are, you know, very trans-friendly organisations that say, of course, there are circumstances where people will identify in order to for malfeasant purposes. Of course there are, it's human nature. So we're not saying, of course that's not all trans people, but equally it's very strange to rule that out a priori. It's completely strange.
You'll appreciate that the committee has received evidence highlighting fears that if this approach was ever used, it could threaten women's access to single-sex spaces. What would you say in response to those concerns?
I think the current Equality Act provisions are acceptable. I think we have a problem with language between the two pieces of legislation, and we need to clarify that we're talking about individuals' lived gender identity. I think that would be really helpful. I think also if we provide a range, as the Yogurt Carter principles have advised, that states should offer a wide range of gender identities for their citizens to adopt and to live in. If we could move to that and recognise that as trans people, we know what we're doing. We're not the danger. And we shouldn't be looking to address any issues around predatory men by marginalising a small community who themselves are all too often victimised by predatory men. We are totally understanding as a community of the issues raised by gender-critical women, because we are also victims.
I think it's really important that we recognise that many trans individuals are vulnerable, right? Because we are all under patriarchal structures, and it is patriarchal structures that make women vulnerable, make trans individuals vulnerable, make homosexuals vulnerable, and so on. But what I heard in the last panel was Professor Sharpe completely dismissing out of hand women's fears and women's concerns around violence, and dismissing out of hand the cases where, and they are cases from many countries, not just from the UK, where men have used the self-ID regimes of those countries in order to access women's spaces, particularly prisons, in order to rape them. One rape is too many, and I don't think we should ever dismiss out of hand those concerns. That's not to say that all men, as Kathleen said, are predatory, and certainly not all trans individuals are. But we have to have laws in place that protect the most vulnerable, and we have to recognise women's vulnerability.
Here we are again. Denmark, Ireland, Malta, Norway, Belgium, Portugal, Luxembourg, Iceland. Scotland are doing it now. The Prime Minister of Finland, Sanna Marin, and there's an example of a great feminist, she's going to follow suit. So we've got, and then Stephen mentioned all the South American and Central American countries. There are 20 countries around the world that have already done it. And that's not mentioning all the American states and Canadian provinces and Australian states that have already taken this step. There's nothing, and they haven't had problems, they haven't had significant problems. And yet in Britain, we seem to have this panic. It's absurd.
We heard a lot in the last session about Ireland, but I think it's also notable, and what's come to light in the course of our public discussion in the UK is that there's evidence that trans activist organisations have deliberately tried to keep the discussion of gender recognition reform under the radar, talking directly to politicians, but keeping it out of the public eye. And that came out in a document that was published, well, I'm thinking of an article in The Spectator by James Kirkup, but it talks about this document published by, I think it was Denton's legal organisation, advising trans activist organisations about how best to get what they want. So I think that's profoundly anti-democratic, and there isn't a massively stunning history of women's rights in Ireland. So when we're confronted now with this, Ireland as the place where everything's fine, I would really like to know, A, how many of ordinary citizens in Ireland knew what was happening when the law was changed, and B, what effect has all that had on ordinary women, if indeed their daily lives have changed in relation to exposure to trans people in changing rooms and so on. So I think we need more information there too, and we can't just assume because we've been told by trans activist organisations everything's fine in these other countries that it is.
And I think to add to that, we are always told about the example of Malta. Malta, abortion is illegal, it's criminalised in Malta. Many of the countries that are cited around, look at these great self-ID regimes, first of all, the citation doesn't drill down into the detail about retaining sex-based exemptions, but as Kathleen says, certainly doesn't drill down into the detail around very shocking and very recent histories on women's rights.
I think part of the confusion over the language of self-identification as well is that all of us self-identify all the time. We might identify as beer drinkers, EastEnders fans, vegetarians, as young or as middle-aged, as a woman, as British. And when a person walks into a women's toilet, for example, they are usually effectively self-identifying as a woman, regardless of whether or not they are trans. That is something that everybody does, not just trans people. That is, unless of course they're a male janitor, because there are other reasons men may enter women's toilets. Similarly, I think I'd like to briefly discuss census, because this is a question that's often come up in these debates. If the question, for example, on the census about sex is simply, what is your sex? No amount of philosophical commentary about sex and gender will stop trans women from answering female, trans men from answering male, and non-binary people from wondering where they fit. This is the reality of trans people's lives. For example, as a trans woman, my lived sex is female, regardless of what I have on my birth certificate, which nobody ever sees. We understand ourselves as female, and especially if we were in a supportive social environment, we are usually perceived by others around us as female for good and for ill when we encounter discrimination. Many of us also have female biological sex characteristics, for example, if we are taking hormones. In this way, as a social researcher, I'd say, if I'm designing a good survey question, I need to take into account how people understand it, their everyday understanding, rather than trying to tell research participants that their understanding is wrong. Similarly, if the law is to work, if we are not just to have trans people casually breaking the law just by going about living their lives in the ways we have always done, it needs to work with the lived reality of our sex and our gender. Self-identification works. So thank you for raising that quite complex issue.
And you argue that data providers should be encouraged to collect data on respondents' sex as a distinct from gender identity. Is it possible for that to be done in a way which doesn't undermine both the GRA and those who have obtained a gender recognition certificate?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that, because actually earlier this year the ONS raised this with me as a possible objection to asking for sex in the census. I would say that, you know, when we collect data, privacy considerations are also always paramount. It's always anonymized. It's not about outing people. So I was very pleased that a recent legal opinion that's just come out in the last couple of days challenges what I was told by ONS. So apparently the EHRC has misrepresented the law according to a legal opinion by Aidan O'Neill QC, and if I may quote from that, he concluded that a mandatory question relative to what was your sex at birth will not constitute an unlawful intrusion into an individual's right to respect for their private life if the information is required by a public authority or a private body exercising public law functions in accordance with law and the information is properly necessary for the achievement of a legitimate aim. So in response to that, A Woman's Place have challenged EHRC to change their guidance in line with that.